Good evening and welcome to the new Bugajski Hour from Washington, D.C. I would like to thank Voice of America for hosting the Washington episodes of my show for RTK. And today I will be discussing important international questions with a major security analyst. Our guest on the Bugajski hot seat is Glenn Howard, President of the Jamestown Foundation here in Washington. But first, my political commentary on a key international topic is entitled Making Deals with Russia. The future of economic sanctions against Russia for its ongoing attack on Ukraine has become a litmus test for the foreign policy and effectiveness of President Donald Trump. The easing of any component of US sanctions would be viewed as a victory in the Kremlin. Moreover, linking sanctions with any potential cooperation in fighting ISIS is a self-defeating strategy. It assumes that Moscow seeks to combat anti-Western jihadism, whereas in reality, the Kremlin fans Islamist terrorism to distract the White House from its own international ambitions. America's Vice President and Secretary of State have both reiterated that sanctions imposed for Russia's annexation of Crimea will remain in place until Moscow withdraws from the peninsula. Less clear is whether additional sanctions enforced after the proxy war in Ukraine's Donbass could be eased. If the lifting of economic sanctions is intended to help US business, then Washington needs to include strict conditions to protect its own long-term interests. Such linkage provides an opportunity for Trump to demonstrate his potency in any deal making with Russia. If sanctions are softened, the US should demand corresponding concessions to test Putin's sincerity in honoring bilateral deals. For instance, removing Russian companies from the sectoral sanctions list can be linked with Ukraine regaining full control over the eastern border with Russia. Such commitments must be closely monitored and verified. A number of similar deals could be made in restoring Ukraine's territorial integrity. At the same time, in order to underscore America's firmness, the arms embargo on Ukraine needs to be lifted. Kyiv should be allowed to gain lethal defensive weapons, thus overturning the mistaken Obama approach that weakened Ukraine's self-defenses and encouraged Russia's incursions. A key part of any emerging Trump doctrine should guarantee every US ally and partner the right to defend itself from outside aggression, thus lessening the need for future American military involvement. To guard against Kremlin attempts to manipulate the new US administration, a bipartisan group of senators are introducing new legislation to impose further sanctions on Russia. They are directed against Russia's energy sector and bar US investment in the privatization of state assets. Although passage of such legislation seems unlikely at this point, the fact that Congress is considering the bill conveys a clear warning to Moscow against further meddling in the affairs of neighbors. Trump himself should not view the legislation as a challenge to his foreign policy goals, but as a valuable tool that he can keep in reserve if any deals with Putin are violated. While the new US president portrays himself as an artful deal maker, he must also remember that the Kremlin is notorious as a serial deal breaker. It is time now for the Bugajski hot seat with our special guest, Glenn Howard, President of the Jamestown Foundation here in Washington, D.C. Glenn, thank you for joining me on the show.
Thank you for having me, Janusz.
A lot of ground to cover, particularly regarding foreign policy of the new Trump administration. But before we go into that, tell us a few words, Glenn, about Jamestown Foundation, who you are, what you do, what is your role in Washington, how important you are in the capital.
Surprisingly, Jamestown is one of the oldest foundations in Washington, D.C. that deals with foreign policy. We really began our origins date back to 1982, and from the 1980s until the end of the Cold War, we were known primarily as a place that was known for defectors. We helped many of the Soviet defectors write their memoirs, and we had been known in policy circles. The greatest of these was Arkady Shevchenko, Breaking with Moscow, the best-selling book, and the high-level defector from the Soviet mission in the UN, who worked extensively with Jamestown, and we helped publish over 10 to 15 different memoirs of former KGB officials that had fled to the West and sought asylum. And with the end of the Cold War, Jamestown kind of switched a little bit from its information publishing aspect to becoming an information clearinghouse on the web for research and analysis. So we kind of shifted from being this place for known as for defectors, and now known as a repository of daily reports on terrorism on Eurasia Daily Monitor, one of our flagship publications.
It's the first thing I read every day, by the way.
Well, thank you. It's truly one of the you know, we have an analytical insight into the areas of the world we write about, and we try to maintain a lack of any type of political agenda. So we try to remain nonpartisan and try to provide just a good, objective, fact-based information free of opinion.
You also organize, I know, major conferences periodically in Washington dealing with key international issues in which congressmen and executive branch is also involved.
That's right, and we have one of our former board members is now a Deputy National Security Advisor to the President of the United States, KT McFarland. So we're quite proud of that, and we've had very good connections with General Mattis, who traveled with us to Egypt in 2015. So there are some key people in the administration that we have had some ties and links to, and we're quite proud of that.
Excellent. So let's start with the administration. We have a new administration. It's in its infancy. It's only a month old, more or less. It's still taking shape. There have been some missteps, some positive moves. How would you summarize the first few weeks in office, particularly on the foreign policy side?
Well, I think it's frequently been kind of comment upon that I think that Trump will have more of a domestic aspect to his administration in the first 100 days. People have commented that he's not going to take any major foreign trips. He's focusing domestically, and most people focus on his Twitter feeds and things that he's saying. But you know, the first 20, 30 days of this administration have been trying to fill the key senior positions in the administration. There's been a lot of turmoil around that, and as there is in any administrations is starting off, probably a little bit more with this administration, but because foreign policy was not the strongest aspect of what Trump offered to the American people. So we're now seeing these positions starting to be filled out. They've just named a new national security advisor, but they've been trying to find the administrative side, the staffing. 75% of the jobs in the Pentagon, their political appointees, have not been filled. So they're trying to put people into these positions. They also have to get clearances. But they can't move to filling all the positions until they get the number 2, number 3 people appointed, and that's where they've been having some difficulties. But I would say that this administration, from what I've heard, has been mostly in a listening mode to many key things about what is going on. When they met with foreign officials 2 weeks ago, they met with the Georgian foreign minister. Both Flynn, when he was National Security Advisor, and Tillerson met with them. I think they're trying to get situated into their positions. They're trying to listen, and once they develop a foreign policy, they're incorporating all this information, and it will go into some type of foreign policy vision. But I think that one of the things that they're starting to inherit that's very similar to the Bush administration is that you're starting to see pushback from them, and that is when the Russians push on the United States, you're starting to see, beginning with Trump's call to Poroshenko, the statements by Mattis and Pence recently at the Munich Security Conference, you're starting to see some pushback by the administration against Russia and Russian influence. Now, that's not necessarily saying that's a policy. They're trying to formulate their policy, but in key areas where they've seen the ceasefire in Ukraine intensify and get out of control, they have made some statements reiterating their support, including Trump's statement for Crimea, that reiterating and stating again that Crimea is a part of Ukraine, was very welcome in Kiev. So I think once they start to get situated more with these positions, and even more so with the naming of McMaster as a National Security Advisor, who has referred to Russia and China as revisionist powers. So I think this is a very good sign. I think the best, most ideal candidate for a national security advisor is actually somebody who's been studying Russian warfare and used in eastern Ukraine. And I think that's exactly the type of person you want as a national security advisor to be warning.
Well, Trump seems to develop a very solid national security team. I think that's undeniable now. What role does Trump himself play in foreign policy? I mean, he doesn't have much experience. He has business experience. He doesn't have much experience in foreign policy, in security and military policy. Will he allow the security team to basically design policy, or what will be his role in that?
I think that he is going to provide input. I mean, I don't think he's a very details-oriented person, but he follows certain instincts that he has. And I think that initially his instincts were from a position of leverage, was trying to develop some type of rapport with Putin. I think there's been 4 U.S. presidents have both tried that approach and failed. But I think if you're looking at it from the perspective of Trump, his number one priority and promise to the American people was to destroy ISIS and to declare war on ISIS and eliminate that problem as a threat. I think in his strategic thinking, if you could call it that, is the idea that if you're trying to go after ISIS in Syria, you don't want the Russians meddling and creating problems for you in your own backyard. So I think he was trying to buy time until he met Putin. And as he recently said, he's not going to be seeing the Russian president probably until the G20 summit in July. So that's a very long time for the Russians and for Putin to sit around and wait on the United States. So I think what I found interesting was that the Dunford visit to Baku was immediately followed that same day by Russian missile strikes in Raqqa in Syria, the capital of ISIS. So I think that and the purpose of the Dunford meeting was to inform the Russians that we were going to be conducting military operations in Syria, and that we wanted to make sure that they would not be interfering with that. And the fact that Dunford was asked to go to Moscow and Minsk to meet, and he declined those meetings and instead chose to go to Baku was a statement by itself, and which strategically was quite interesting. So I think you're starting to see in these outlying areas some new markers are being set by this administration. It's clearly set out a marker that Ukraine and Donbass and Crimea are part of Ukraine, and calls for to stop of this, for no more ceasefire violations. And now you're starting to see them preparing for military operations in Syria. So I think that this is the best way to look at it, but I think, again, that Putin won't sit around and wait.
In terms of how would you, I know, again, it's very early days. There's still major foreign policy challenges are ahead. And as we saw during the Bush administration, suddenly something like 9/11 could throw everything in a completely different direction. How would you, though, characterize this administration? Is it instinctively interventionist? Some have said Trump is an isolationist, a protectionist, or these terms don't mean very much at present. How would you describe it?
I would call it Nixonian, and I think that many Americans and many people that are you and I are old enough to remember Nixon in that time period, but there's a certain Nixonian element to Trump. And I think that his ideas on the economy, nations, and an American role in the world are very similar in many ways to Nixon, but there's also, not entirely, but I think there are some parallels. For example, Nixon hated the press, and same way with Trump, he hates the press as well. But I think that I think he aspires to some level of détente with Russia, but I think it's also a lot of people told me that even Trump and has indicated a couple times, they're very guarded about Putin, and they're very realistic about what to expect from Putin. But Trump is also a businessman first, and I think many of the problems of looking at Trump are that he's an industrialist. He's someone that is a businessman, invested in places and built up. And so his approaches are this economic aspect, and his strategic culture is formed by the art of the deal, of trying to coax people like Putin by saying nice things about him, because that's the art of the negotiations. He's setting up his opponent for some type of I wouldn't say competitive rivalry, but some type of form of engagement where he's, and you know, and ideally you don't want a crisis with the Russia in the first 100 days of administration. In some ways, it's being very smart by trying to take a very delayed approach, continue to say nice things, but in the background he has people like Mattis, and now he has McMaster, and I think that from what I've seen of the Russian press, they're quite scared of these people. They don't know quite sure what to think of them, and I think that's putting Russians on edge. And I think that's a good thing.
Beware of what you wish for, you could say, in terms of
exactly.
Moscow's initial support for Trump. I'll come back to Russia in a moment, but I'd like to look a little bit about NATO, because it's of primary concern, obviously, for the Balkan region. There are still NATO troops, American troops, even present in Kosovo, Bond-Steel, and they do play a very important role. The president, well, actually, before he became president, Trump was quite critical of NATO. I mean, granted, the burden-sharing question is extremely important, but using terms such as NATO being obsolete, not important, and so forth, that worried quite a few people, I think, in Europe. I think the record has been somewhat, let's say, corrected now by General Mattis's visit and Mike Pence's visit to Europe. But how does Trump actually view NATO? Is it an essential alliance, or is it something that can be made part of the deal?
I think that if you go back to his initial interviews where he questioned NATO, he was positing it as a question, not as a statement. And then from that, many people in the media kind of twisted this information about his views of NATO, that it was a view. It was more of a question in a larger scale, you know, asking the question, has NATO outlived its usefulness? Now, we do know that General Mattis has exercised a lot of influence on Trump. I think that his views have not been sophisticated or articulated in a way that they're still being formed. And I think that many people take the statements in their literal form and don't quite understand how Trump thinks, and therefore there's some things that kind of flow from these statements that people take as policy. And I think that the people surrounding Trump have been more than, you know, Mattis and Pence and others, I've been pretty clear about that there's, I mean, Mattis has clearly said that NATO is more important than ever. If it didn't exist, we'd have to create it. So I think that's very critical and very important. And I think that, you know, again, Trump wants to focus on the economy first, and I think that foreign policy will come later. But I do think that from a foreign policy perspective, if you're the United States and your goal is to try to be able to sell American cars and see them on the streets of downtown Berlin, that the best way to get that is through negotiations and Trump type of leverage. Now, I think that that with Britain's departure from the European Union, I think that the United States alliance and military relations with Britain have even grown closer because of that. Now, I think that when Trump looks at Eastern Europe, he will look at it from a perspective of what type of leverage will that give the United States in dealing with the European Union. Therefore, countries like that are on the fringes of Europe, such as Eastern Europe, Romania, and others, that will have a more difficult time trying to find a way with this administration to find some useful, important strategic role. But that doesn't mean that the Poles or the Romanians cannot remain close to Berlin, but also remain close to the United States. But it may result in some type of bilateral trade agreements in some ways with the United States that will try to help benefit the nature of the alliance and relations between these countries. But certainly the NATO aspect is stronger than ever, and I think that is already leading to even greater for example, Britain is developing even closer military relations with Romania and Ukraine and Turkey because of the recent developments with the Brexit. So I think, go ahead.
No, sorry, I was going to sort of come to Brexit in a moment. Not just what it signifies for the EU, but potentially the interface between EU and US. But you raised an important point, because I think actually Trump's focus on burden sharing may actually have a positive result, because increasing number of countries are revisiting their commitment to the NATO alliance. They understand the threat from Russia. They understand the potential withdrawal, if you like, from the United States. I don't think it will happen, but at least it's a warning that it could happen. So I think it's good in a way. It's focused attention on the importance of security. And also another aspect, I think, is territorial defense. In other words, a lot more spending has to be smart spending, to make sure that they are properly protecting themselves before they call for NATO allies to protect them. So paradoxically, I think Trump's statements may have done, we'll see how it develops, some good for NATO revitalization.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the 2% argument was being made. I was making this in several of the capitals in the Baltic states of countries that were under 2% specifically. And they were adamant about not needing to increase their defense spending beyond 1.4%, which is what one foreign minister of one Baltic capital told me. And so we have to understand that there are divisions within those societies that people within the Ministry of Defense of these countries have been advocating this for a long time, but the civilian policymakers were the ones preventing them from doing this. So now I think in some ways that Trump is strengthening the hands of those people that have been saying all along that they needed to focus more on territorial defense, they need to increase their defense spending. So I think this is actually helping those particular groups focus more on this. And but I'm hoping too that Mattis has talked about creating more of a NATO membership of countries in the Persian Gulf region of Arab states. He is starting to think out of the box about what type of alignments we need, and I'm hoping that the Black Sea and Baltic will become more of a sharpened focus. Yeah. And I think it'll, if you watch any videos of McMaster on YouTube, you'll see that the new National Security Advisor has a very, very keen sense of history and is very well read and understands, and he has actually overseen assessments of Russian military operations in Ukraine. So he knows this danger quite well.
So is the Secretary of Defense, who I gather is an avid reader and is familiar with every war fought in ancient Greece, let alone recent wars. Let me turn a little bit to the European Union. Again, Trump has been critical of the European Union as an international institution. He was quite supportive of Brexit, I remember, during his visit to Scotland during the time of the vote. I mean, a lot of people in Europe view the European Union as having both downside and upside. The downside being an unelected bureaucracy, democracy deficit, limitations in sovereignty. But the upside, countries such as Kosovo, Serbia, others would like to join the European Union because of the benefits it bestows. How will Trump view the future of the European Union?
Well, I think it's obviously in a very negative way. I mean, if he wants to level the playing field with the European Union to sell American goods, and he's not able to achieve that, I mean, you have to remember that Trump was someone that wanted to build the golf course in Ireland and was prevented from doing so because of EU regulations. So from a business perspective, he knows the challenges of conducting business within the European Union. Now, those countries that you actually write a blog called The Edge of Europe, and I think that is very, that these countries on the edge of Europe are going to have more, in some ways, being outside the European Union may actually be a godsend for these countries, because the United States, if it finds it easier to sell goods to these countries, I think it would be, more beneficial to them in their bilateral relations with the United States. It obviously will upset the Germans, but I don't think, but I think that at the end of the day, it's all about trying to develop closer relations with both sides, with Berlin, the European Union, and also with the United States. So I think that you can ride this fence. I think that the countries of Eastern Europe, and I've talked to Poles about this, they certainly understand the complexities of this this relationship with Brussels and also with the United States. But there are different dimensions to this that I think that once it evolves in their strategy, and that it may actually be beneficial for them. And I think, a case in point was about Britain trying to import more tomatoes from Morocco. Previously, they couldn't import tomatoes from Morocco because the tomatoes they had to import were from Spain. So it's actually going to end up being cheaper economically for Britain. So on the edges of Europe, so these countries may actually find more benefits in some areas to them, even though they're still outside of the European Union.
It's a very complex picture, because it's almost like a machine that's moving. The countries that have already been through the European Union are looking at the European Union, something that may be restricting, as you said, restricting their options, their economic options. countries that really want to enter see the benefits of structural funds, adhesion funds, all the funding that they get from Brussels that really helps them restore and build their infrastructure, as we saw in Southern Europe, as we saw in other parts of the Balkans. So it's a very, very complex picture, what you gain and lose through European Union membership. But the question I have, though, is in terms of relations with NATO. For example, Britain leaves the European Union. Will it be more or less committed to defending Europe from a Russian attack?
Absolutely.
If it no longer has economic ties?
Absolutely, yes. You have seen nothing but Britain's ties to the Baltic states deepen. Britain has signed a bilateral military intelligence sharing agreement with Romania and Turkey since the Brexit. So you see Britain's military, they're sending warships to the Black Sea for the first time in decades. And so you're starting to see an intensification of the periphery, which has always been, for Britain, has always been a strategic dimension of Britain and its relations with the continent, have always forged very close relations with the periphery countries. And I think that you're starting to see that. And now some people said that Britain being outside of the EU is going to hurt the aspects of creating an European Union security force. Well, I'm sorry, but I would, if there's any area that I'd like to see Britain improve upon, that would be its interaction with NATO and deepening its ties. And you're starting to see that even more now. I mean, Britain is sending ground troops to Estonia as a part of the rotating battalions that are going through. They're sending British tanks to Estonia. So, and British military operations in the Baltic are at an all-time high. So I really don't, and the fact that you look at what their interactions with Romania and then going into Ukraine and bilateral military cooperation with Ukraine, they're starting to get further involved. I see nothing but a very positive sign there because, you know, for pretty much right now, the only military power in Europe is really France and Poland, with the two largest militaries in Europe. Right. So Britain is going through a period of modernization. And doesn't even have an aircraft carrier, but you know they are in the process of making some major changes.
If indeed European Union continues to decline, let's say other countries break away or are less committed to the European Union, will this spill over into NATO? In other words, will growing nationalism, assertion of national sovereignty affect NATO cohesion?
I think the alliance will only get stronger because they will want to cling to something that already exists, and that is a Euro-Atlantic orientation, which they signal when they joined NATO. So I think that from that aspect, the economic side is a little bit unclear. But I think that, you know, what's interesting is that even the 1970s and 1973 with Heath, who was the Prime Minister of Britain, had very difficult relations with the United States and Nixon over Britain's ties to the European Union at that time. Right. So I see these issues as something that we can survive and get by with. But at the end of the day, it's going to be about the ability to sell American goods and trying to get access to these markets, and that the European Union will not limit the United States' ability to sell. And that's where I think, you know, the biggest direction is going. I've noticed that since the Brexit that Britain's exports have obviously picked up tremendously. So there's been a manufacturing increase. And I think that's trying to create a manufacturing and industrial base in some of these countries. You know, may actually be a good thing if they're not totally appended to what goes on in Berlin.
Let's turn now to specifically the Balkans. Do you expect any new initiatives or policy changes with the Trump administration regarding the Balkans, Western Balkans, former Yugoslavia? Well,
I've always said since the day one of Trump being elected that the fact that his wife is Slovenian should really signify that you know, a president of the United States is going to have a nightly conversation with his family, and part of that conversation every night may actually be about Eastern Europe. And what's going on in Slovenia, and especially because Melania's parents are living with them. But I think that you know, there is that aspect as someone who's invested in Europe. Trump has invested in Georgia, Kazakhstan, and other places. Has a certain understanding of this level of the world, this part of the world. And the same way with Rex Tillerson. You know, Rex Tillerson has also invested in these areas and understands it. So in some ways, it's not a John Kerry. It's someone that's actually understands at least the political dynamics of what, say, Slovenia went through in the 90s, during the Yugoslav breakup and the Balkan Wars. I'm sure that is something that Melania can probably talk to a lot of people about and knows extensively.
Well, exactly. Slovenia is a NATO member. Would Trump support further NATO enlargement in the Balkans?
That would be that's an unknown question, and I don't know if necessarily continued NATO expansion is really going to be at the forefront of issues right now. I think that the forefront of issues for the United States, from a national security perspective, will be what to do about ISIS. So. The problem is that in the 2000s, with the invasion of Iraq, we focused so much on out-of-area conflicts that countries like Estonia refused to abandon the territorial concept of defense. So that ended up being a very negative thing for the national security of these countries. And so if Trump tries to go into Syria and tries to take care of the problem, the question will be, what would be the role of Eastern European countries to do that? But I think that they will focus and keep a very strong eye on Russia and terrorism. And I think that those two issues will forge a lot of their national security and their posture and their defense spending and how we position troops. And we don't know what next crisis may be in store. And Ukraine has shown anything if anything, that is still a very, very dangerous conflict.
The reason I ask is Montenegro is on track to become a member actually this year. I mean, I think most European NATO parliaments have already passed, ratified, approved of Montenegro's accession. The Senate is still to do so in Washington. And I think even General Flynn recommended to Trump that he accept Montenegro's membership in NATO, which would make the passage much easier in the Senate. Do you expect this to happen anytime soon?
I do not see any negative signs. I have not heard one negative thing from people mentioned conversations with this administration about what they're going to do about Montenegro. Everything still seems to be very positive, and that I think that the idea of the Adriatic, as a strategic area for the United States and the Mediterranean and its access, basing access that Montenegro offers, I think that they look at that and they welcome it.
And it completes the NATO, let's say, control over the Adriatic and prevents any Russian basing.
Yeah, I would agree.
And the next step, of course, Secretary of Defense General Mattis has made during his testimony, I believe, made a statement that Kosovo should strengthen its military, should speed up the creation of its military. Presumably, that the reasoning being that the sooner Kosovo can defend itself, the less reason to have U.S. troops, and the quicker it itself can contribute to the NATO alliance. Do you see that as a next step in the region?
I agree. That's all part of the 2%. I mean, 2% in burden sharing is. Too often they focus on the 2% and they don't talk about burden sharing. Well, the burden sharing part is to develop your military so that you can take care of yourself. And this is a debate that's been going on in Lithuania extensively about the size of its armed forces and how big should they be and what size of a reserve force should they develop. Because the model of Finland is becoming very predominant in many of the Baltic states, that they need to have a very small standing army, but with a very large territorial reserve force that can be mobilized within 10 days. And I think that is the wave of where a lot of the directions of these countries is going. But some countries are different. I see Poland and Romania really are the two countries that are very important security deterrents with large professional militaries in the Black Sea and the Baltic for Poland. That are really indispensable allies for the United States in two very key areas.
In terms of self-defense, I think one of the failings of the Obama administration was not to allow the Ukrainians to be able to purchase openly lethal defensive weapons to protect themselves against Russia. Will the Trump administration, you think, push for a country to be able to defend itself, particularly a NATO ally? And a NATO partner in the case of Ukraine as part of the Partnership for Peace program?
Well, I would go back to Newt Gingrich, an advisor to Trump, was in Ukraine in August this year before the election, and he gave an interview to a Ukrainian newspaper where he said that Ukraine should be able to receive defensive weapons to defend itself. I have heard also privately to other people, I think Mattis shares that view very strongly. But I'm also of the belief that Javelin anti-tank weapons are not necessarily a panacea to Ukraine's problems defensively. Many people focus and get caught up on the technology side without focusing on the fact that Ukraine has a very Soviet standard type of military that has made a lot of mistakes and is refusing to reform itself. And so I think that there needs to be more pressure on Ukraine to get rid of Ukrainian Navy, for example. They have 19 admirals in the Ukrainian Navy. They have no Navy. Why are there 19 admirals? So again, bureaucratically, they have a very large Soviet type of era makeup of their forces that they're modernizing and starting to reform, but they're nowhere near what they should be.
To be fair to the Ukrainians, I mean, recent reports I've read, and I think General Wesley Clark has done some reporting recently, some analysis of the Ukrainian military, that things are improving. In other words, they're weaning themselves away from the old Soviet-type military to a modern force. Decision-making has been more decentralized. Communications, command and control, things are improving on that, let's say, command front. And through the experience of battle in Donbass.
That's right. But Ukraine, in 20 years of experience, never once had a military exercise larger than 1,000 men. We are talking about dealing with a Russian army of over 200,000 men. They don't have the experience in moving armies around. Now, they are defending them, no doubt about that. No doubt that they're defending themselves better now. But on paper and organizationally, they don't have the command and control capabilities at a level to be able to stop a very large-scale Russian attack. That they are, most of their forces are bogged down in eastern Ukraine, and I think strategically, yes, on paper and in some areas they're making the reforms and doing a lot better, but there's still a very larger effort underway that they still haven't made the changes that we had hoped that they would make. And I think when Wes Clark says that, I think that he's trying to encourage the Ukrainians, but there still needs to be more tough love messages with the Ukrainians behind doors. And in fact, you know, the chief of the General Staff Ukrainian Army is actually, or the Ukrainian Minister of Defense is a former policeman. Now, what is the Ukrainian Minister of Defense? I mean, it's trying to taking a police captain and making him suddenly in charge of hundreds of thousands of men moving them around. That's not the ideal condition for a country that that may potentially involve the United States in a major conflict with Russia. I am all for supporting Ukraine, but it has to be done in a way that's very smart.
Sure, they have to reform and spend and reorganize, basically. But that brings us also to the Baltic states, which, despite the fact that they're in NATO, they're still very vulnerable to any kind of overwhelming Russian attack. How would the U.S., I know it's a hypothetical situation, but some in the Baltics have been very worried, how would the U.S. respond to a Russian assault on one of the NATO Baltic states?
Well, you know, there's two images that come up, you know, and one is the 82nd Airborne arriving to stop Russian armor coming in from Belarus. The other is in the images of Dunkirk. Of U.S. forces getting there, being overrun, and then suddenly we have to leave the region because these militaries don't have, we don't have pre-stored armor deployed there. They're, you know, the Brits are sending 20 Challenger tanks to Estonia. There are over 221 tanks in the Western Military District of Russia that are T-90 capacity T-80s. The most sophisticated tanks in the Russian Army are on the very borders of these countries.
Right.
So the ability for us to fly and getting things here is really a strategic question, you know, because if Vilnius is being overrun and Americans are seeing on their television that the Lithuanian army is retreating past Vilnius and they're calling for American troops to arrive, you know, will people in the United States question whether the American troops should be there? And that's a problem that we don't have a lot of time to deal with because these types of attacks would take 3 to 4 days. The country could be overrun. And this is a country like Lithuania that has no tanks. So the only tanks that we have in the Baltic states are from these rotated units that are coming through and are rotated, not there on a constant basis. So there's some very hard questions to be asked and these countries in their defense spending, what they do, how we get stuff there. Poland has one of the largest armored forces in Europe, but they have to get through the Suwalki Gap to get to be able to defend Lithuania. So, you know, the Russians have the advantage of being able to pick their battles whenever they want. So the questions you're asked are very good ones. I agree with them. But, you know, there are more Russian troops in Kaliningrad than there are in the entire, all three militaries of all three Baltic states combined. So we're talking 30,000 men in Kaliningrad that are larger than the combined forces of all three Baltic states. So how, you know, when these states try to defend themselves, and they just now started conscription, they've just, Latvia still doesn't have conscription, they still have very small territorial forces. I mean, we are talking about, in the case of Lithuania, they've announced they're going to get up to 30,000 men as a reserve force within 5 years. Well, I'm sorry, but 5 years is not.
But small populations at the same time. I mean,
well,
comparatively.
yes and no. Yes and no. The population of Finland is 5 million. Okay, population of Lithuania is 2.7, 2.8 million. So, based upon Finland, which has a population of 5 million, they have a reserve territorial force of 323,000 men.
Maintain that, yeah.
So, so if you take even just a part of that, one would expect Lithuania, with its manpower, at least to have an army, a reserve force of 100,000 men. But when you raise this issue now in Lithuania, people look at you, they're not ready to make that decision. So we go back to the whole issue about burden sharing in NATO. Because really, you know, is burden sharing and asking them to pay more, is that a legitimate request? And so far, up until Trump, they never said it publicly. They only saying it privately. But when you start saying it publicly, then the speakers of parliaments, then the opposition parties in these states can go back and say, let's have a debate. What type of force do we want? And I think I think this is what this is setting in motion, is the type of force structure that these states want to have, but also to make them realize that they have to defend their countries for their defense.
And I think Russia's contributed to this, obviously, by its actions in Ukraine, but also its threats against other states.
No doubt.
I mean, it's focused attention on back to territorial defense, how we defend our countries. Let's turn now, because our time is getting a bit short, to terrorism. I mean, combating ISIS and presumably other forms of Islamist terrorism is a centerpiece of Trump's foreign policy. A lot of people in Eastern Europe are going to be asking, is this going to revive a sort of Bush policy of more direct involvement, whether in Syria, in Iraq again, or other parts of the Middle East? And will they be called upon to contribute to new American troop deployments?
I would not see that at this stage. I'd say that, you know, you got to remember that Trump is someone that criticized Bush for intervention in Iraq.
Yeah.
So I think he is more of along the lines of not to go in and remove them and occupy it and stay there, but to get in and get out. And I think that's a fundamental difference in, say, the philosophy of how he may look at the use of force. Now, the Obama administration clearly could have stayed in Iraq, but it chose not to with the follow-on basing agreement. And if they would have had that base there in Iraq, they would have been able to prevent the Iranians from flying resupplies through Iraqi airspace to Syria. There's a lot of things they could have done. So I think that when we look at the nature of conflict and how the Trump administration may involve itself, I think they're going to go into Syria with ground troops, which is what they've said they're going to do. They're going to go in there with a strategy. They're going to work with a country like Turkey, and the Iraqi government is now making a lot of success in Mosul. So if they get Islamic State out of Mosul and they push them into Syria, then I see, you know, you can see a military campaign coming in. And even President Assad said now that he would accept U.S. ground troops in Syria. So the point is to get stuff in and get out and have some type of force on the ground that they can cooperate with, but not remain as an occupier. And I think that's what Trump has in his mind.
Isn't the problem, though, with groups like ISIS and other international terrorists, as soon as, it's like an amoeba, as soon as you push them out of one place, they take root in another?
Yeah, it's the whack-a-mole.
So it's going to be from country to country. And, you know, where do you finally corral them and destroy them? It keeps moving.
Well, I agree with that. You know, they call that the whack-a-mole strategy, where you hit it in one area and then it goes to another area. And I think that this is, I think with the case of Raqqa, you know, what is happening is that I think the United States had believed that when it intervened in Iraq, that Iraqis would have a strong state identity. And we did not see that in Iraq. There was a fundamental miscalculation in that. And I think now, slowly, as Iraq's been pulling itself together, there's starting to be some elements of a state identity. They're starting to recapture Mosul. If they push ISIS out of Mosul, they will go, they're fleeing to Syria. So Mattis has said before that if you can get ISIS in one area and then isolate them, then you go in for the kill and destroy them. And I think that that's the idea, is that you go in and with a very large ground force, you take them out and don't prevent them from going somewhere else. But your question is a very good one, because Al-Qaeda, Islamic State have shown themselves ability to reinvent themselves. But the point of it, though, I guess, is the failed state. So the question comes in on the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Syria, will it remain together as a state? And will they work with Assad and Turkey and Russia to rebuild Syria as a state? And maybe this is where the fundamental difference with Trump would be, is that he believes in states. He doesn't believe in interventionist wars to prop up certain countries. He believes in the ability of state borders and sovereignties. And I think that is one aspect of his strategy and policy that I think that will be in play in Syria. Now, he said he wants to create a big, beautiful, safe zone in Syria. Now, Hillary Clinton and Leon Panetta won the same thing, but Obama refused to listen to him. So maybe if they would have had the safe zone, there wouldn't be 3 million refugees in Europe now. I don't know. But if they do create something as a safe zone, then maybe you have that ability to exert influence and pressure on Assad to come to some type of coalition government. I'm not holding my breath on that, but especially with the Russians involved, as the Poles know from experience.
Right. Well, specifically in terms of Kosovo and other countries in the Balkans, what can they contribute to this American effort to defeat ISIS? Or let's say constrain ISIS?
Well, I'd say in the case of Albania, it's also the ideology. You know, the flow of foreign fighters that have gone from Albania and Kosovo to Syria have been a problem, and the ability to
that has gone down, by the way, quite dramatically.
It has, yeah. And I think that because they're getting killed. I mean, a lot of that is it's being more difficult to get there. But I think, you know,
but they've cracked down on recruitment as well.
No doubt about it, no doubt. But there have been places in Albania that have been problems, but I think that, you know, that in this war of ideology, of trying to deal with Islamist elements, I think that Albania can play a very significant role in that struggle, just through its own experience.
Last question, because I think we have probably just a minute or so left. In terms of the back to Russia again, Foreign Secretary Lavrov made a statement about the post-West world order at the Munich conference. What does he mean, and how should we respond to this?
Well, as you know from being an astute observer of Russia, is that the Russians believe that there's a dramatic decline and downfall of the West that's looming through our moral values and other things. So I think that statement is tied to that, and it's just, as they say, wishful thinking and whistling past the graveyard, because if anything, the Russia's decline is very much something they're hiding. They cannot, you know, the sanctions have taken a major toll on them, but they do have a modernizing, very sophisticated military. But again, you know, what Lavrov was talking about, decline of the West, I mean, if Trump can do what he says he can do in terms of making the United States reviving our industrial defense base and expanding our military, I mean, peace through strength is something that Reagan said, Trump has said it, and this will have a very, you know, countries like Russia will not like that idea of America becoming stronger.
Do you think maybe the Russians saw Trump as an accomplice in the dismantling of the West, and now they're realizing that he may actually strengthen the West through some of the things that you're saying?
Yes, and I think he's conned Putin, and I think many people that kind of thought Trump would go that route, I think that they kind of fundamentally misunderstood him. I mean, as many people in the United States misunderstood him. Certainly Hillary Clinton misunderstood how strong he was. So I think that you know, and I highly recommend to people to go back and read his book, Art of the Deal. It's a very, very insightful book into how he negotiates, his views of the business. He even talks about his drill instructor that he had when he was at a New York Military Academy and where he went to school. He talks about things that have shaped his life and how to negotiate with people, especially people that are stronger than him.
Okay, on that note, and I'm sure we'll be coming back many times.
I hope so, Janusz. Thank you for having me.
The presidency is in its infancy and there's many months, many years to go. So, and hopefully we'll have a stronger West as a result, rather than a Russian-viewed weak West, basically. Glenn, thank you so much.
Thank you, Janusz.
See you again. Unfortunately, we have already come to the end of today's show. I have greatly enjoyed being with you and with my colleagues at RTK and here at VOA in Washington. Good night, everyone. Stay healthy, be productive, and remain optimistic. See you all very soon. Miru Pavshim.